Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this IDS interdisciplinary seminar. And as you probably already know, today's seminar is about artificial intelligence, but from a more interdisciplinary point of view. So perhaps I can start with a short introduction to give you some background about how artificial intelligence is an interdisciplinary field. So artificial intelligence, by definition, is a simulation of human intelligence processes by machines. So by definition, it's related to humans. And indeed, it is part of a highly interdisciplinary field on the study of human mind called cognitive science. And within cognitive science, we have different fields, including artificial intelligence, psychology, linguistics, anthropology, neuroscience, and also, importantly, philosophy. And so today, we are very honored to have Professor Herman Kaplan to give us a talk to tell us about the relationship between artificial intelligence and philosophy. So let me briefly introduce him. So Professor Kaplan is a chair professor of the Department of Philosophy at Hong Kong U, and also the director of the AI and Humanity Lab. And he's also a steering committee member of the IDS. And before joining Hong Kong U, he was a faculty member at University of Oxford, University of St. Andrews, and University of Oslo. And notably, he has published several books on philosophy and expandable AI. Very excited about that. And he's also an elected member of Academia Europaea and the Norwegian Academy of Arts and Science. And today, he's going to tell us about the philosophy of artificial intelligence. Let's welcome him.
Thank you, Janet, and thanks for having me. I'm very excited about talking to a group of people who are not all philosophers, because I spent a lot of my time talking to philosophers. So I've tried to make this talk super accessible to people who don't have any background in philosophy and no particular training. And the goal is to give you a feel for what we philosophers do and the sorts of issues that we're thinking about. And before I even get to all of that, I just want to do a little bit of stage setting, get a sense of why people would care about AI when they're philosophers and when they're from fields other than computer science. So here's just to start with something that I think should be common ground, like not particularly controversial. Here's the chief executive of Google, Sundar Pichai. He says, famous, constantly cited, tells us, I've always thought of AI as the most profound technology humanity is working on, more profound than fire or electricity or anything that we've done in the past. We're developing technology which, for sure, one day will be far more capable than anything we've seen before. Now that's a really bold claim, more powerful than electricity. Why would it be more significant and profound than electricity? Because electricity is pretty significant. When you think about everything around us right now, like literally everything that you're sitting on or touching or have anything to do with, it wouldn't exist unless we had electricity. So it has had impact beyond anything that you can really easily imagine. But there's a little twist to that, I think. Like, if you go back a few hundred years, they were able to make pretty impressive things. They didn't have electricity. They made food. It was pretty similar to ours. It wasn't all that different. They fell in love. They had children, sent their kids to school. They had universities. They traveled. It took a long time. It took longer time than when you had electricity. But it was still traveling around the world. Explored the world. So I think, just to go back to this claim that it's more profound than electricity, electricity has really incredible effect on the tools and the devices we use in life. But it wasn't transformative maybe in another way. And so here's what I think he has in mind. This is an interpretation. I haven't talked to him about this. And this is the thought that AI has the potential to change not just how we make things around us, not just the tools that we have, but in a way what we are, how we relate to each other, how we talk, how we think, how we structure societies, how we make collective political decisions, how we think about morality. I mean, we've defined ourselves as Homo sapiens, usually defined broadly as something like wise or intelligent man or human being. But if we've now created systems that arguably, potentially, in just a very short time will be smarter, more intelligent, wiser, more capable of giving explanations of the world than us, that changes our self-image in a way that might be more transformative than electricity. I think that's why he said that it was more significant than electricity. And I think we're all aware that this is going to bring a ton of wonderful things with it. The thing people most often immediately springs to mind is medical advancements. There's the potential to identify patterns that leads to new medications and treatments very, very fast. If you care about the climate, and it's hard not to care about that, it's going to be massively helpful to help us think through how to fix that and what kind of trends are happening. It can be very useful in education. It can provide personal, if you think an AI could just track me, my background, my knowledge, my patterns. Think about what an individualized AI could do for my education if I wanted to learn Mandarin, which I should, rather than just sit in a class with a professor talking to 30 people like I'm doing now. So this could be very transformative in that way. It can make a huge difference to all elements of scientific research. It can give increased efficiency. So these are just the beginning of a list of incredibly wonderful things. There's also potentially bad things, and some people really worry about the bad things. The very bad, initial very bad thing is just the thought that we could create these very powerful entities that we don't know what they'll do when they get very powerful. It's just, so Bard, you can get, so ChatGPT is very careful. The new version of Bard is a little bit less careful. And you can play this game with Bard that I think is useful. Just make it answer yes or no. Just say, we're going to play a yes or no game. And then it'll be very opinionated. It'll just give you its view of things. Because if you ask it just a question, like an open-ended question, it'll be giving us some people think this, some people think that. If you make it say yes or no, it'll just give you yes or no. So if you ask Bard, will the world be ruled by AI in 2021? It just says yes. It doesn't explain why, but that's its opinion. The 2022 survey of machine learning researchers, the median respondents thought AI was more likely to be good than bad. But 48% of respondents said they thought there was a 10% or greater chance that the effects of AI would be extremely bad, including human extinction. It's kind of weird that you have a lot of people working on this when they think there's a 10% chance that it could lead to human extinction. I don't think I would work on something that I thought had a 10% chance of leading to human extinction, but apparently these people, the leading researchers in the world, feel okay about it. There's this physicist at MIT that I really like, Max Tegmark. He's got these really weird views about everything. He has a great book about, he's trying to figure out why are numbers so useful in physics. His view is because the world is just made of mathematics. But that's irrelevant to what I'm going to say. It's just an interesting view. He also wrote a great book about AI, and he's really worried about existential risk. And he has this good analogy. I find it helpful. He's imagining these Neanderthals that somehow produced this cute little Homo sapiens baby. And then one of the Neanderthals says, well, shouldn't we be a little careful? Are they safe, these little Homo sapiens? And the people are, no, they're just cute. They're just doing little things for us right now. We got total control over them. That didn't really work out for the Neanderthals. They lost that battle. And so, yeah, there's a thought maybe we should be very careful in the same way that the Neanderthals should have been more careful initially. I think all of this has huge implications for academia. I mean, none of this is original. I'm just like moving you towards why philosophers care about it. It's obviously going to have transformative effects on what we do, how we teach, how we perform research. We will have helpers to help us do it. So none of this is philosophy yet, okay? This is just like me warming you up to why philosophers care about it. And then we get new research topics, and I think here is where we start. Of course, some research topics are on the technical side. How do we make this technology? How do we improve it? How does it get integrated into medical devices and so on? That's ongoing, incredibly important work. But there's also questions like, do they have beliefs? Can they understand our language? Can they act intentionally? Can they be sentient? Famously, one of the Google employees, Blake Lemoine, was absolutely convinced. He worked for Google. He was training their large language model, and he became convinced that it was conscious, and that they had responsibility towards it. And he told the leadership at Google, and they fired him and said he was crazy. But yeah, he had much more access to what is now Bard than any of us have. And he spent a lot of time with it for months and months. Can they reason? Can they have motivations? And if so, what are these motivations? What kind of AIs should be developed? The normative there is important. What norms should govern AI's relationships to humans? So there's a whole bunch of questions that weren't questions before, but now seem to be very important questions. And like Janet said earlier, I think there's just no way to do work on this without doing it multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary. You just need a whole bunch of people from a bunch of different fields: computer science, philosophy, law, psychology, political science, education, to think about these questions. And I just think this is something everyone should be working on this, because it's so important, and I don't think it's really optional. It's going to happen. It's just a question of when it happens. Almost every leading institution in the world is developing these kinds of research centers. No one is doing it particularly well yet. And so over the next 10, 20 years, we're going to figure out who can do this well. Okay, what does philosophy have to do with any of this? So I'll start by giving you, so here's what's going to happen over the next few minutes. I'll give you a little introduction to the background in philosophy, other philosophers who have been thinking about AI. And then I'll gradually move into telling you about my own work. Okay, so this is my supervisor at Berkeley, John Searle. And he had this famous argument called the Chinese room argument. And he was very negative to AI. He had this argument that convinced a lot of people for about 30, 40 years. This paper and the papers in which it's published has like 100,000 citations. It's like one of the most cited papers in philosophy in the 20th century. And the point was, I won't go into the argument now, was that you can never get understanding or meaning or anything genuinely cognitive out of an artificial system. It's just not doable. Basically, you need to have the kind of organic material that humans are made of in order to get it. It emerges in some weird way that he never fully explained from that kind of stuff. And there are people today who influentially argue just like that. So that's one type of work that's been going on for about 40 years. The stuff I just talked about existential risk, originates, a lot of that literature just goes back to the Oxford philosopher Nick Bostrom, who wrote a book called Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, Strategies. It is one of the most influential philosophy books the last 20 years. Almost everyone in tech who talks kind of generally about the future of AI refer to this book. And when people worry about existential risk, the dangers of AI, this is one of the foundational works. Lots of work have been done on the ethics of AI and robotics. People are worried about privacy. Who has access to all the information that we'll be putting in? Is that going to belong to big corporations, to governments? Who has access to it? There's worry about whether these systems, being smarter than us, can manipulate us. And if someone owns that system, tells it to manipulate you to drink Pepsi instead of Coca-Cola, is that something that's just a fantasy, or could it actually happen? Can it have biases? Do we have any obligations towards artificial systems? How should we treat them? How should they treat us? These are all things that fall under the category of the ethics of AI and robotics. I'll do 2 more of these. This is not what I'm going to talk about. They're just examples of what philosophers work on. I don't know if you've heard Elon Musk and a lot of other people say there's distinct possibility, fairly high probability that we're living in a simulation. That argument goes back. There's also Nick Bostrom, by the way, and a bunch of other philosophers like Dave Chalmers. Chalmers thinks it's a 20% chance that we live in a simulation. And so these arguments are things that play out in philosophy. They have a 200, 300-year history in philosophy. But if you want really sophisticated discussions of it, I think philosophy is the place to go. I think Dave Chalmers has a new book called The Philosophy of Virtual Reality, where he's interested in questions about the status of objects in the metaverse. Are they real? Are they an illusion? Can you live a life? Can you perform genuine actions? Can you have knowledge and so on in a virtual reality? And that's another field. Okay, so that's a little kind of background about the philosophy of AI. Now I'm going to start zooming slowly in and tell you a little bit about what I care about. So here are some questions I think are incredibly interesting, and they're interesting. They were interesting to me before because there were issues that I and lots of other philosophers worked on before we started thinking about AI. And then when AI came around, this was just a continuation of stuff we've bed doing all along, but incredibly interesting because it helped us do philosophy better, and we managed to understand this new field. So we were interested in questions like, does ChatGPT is just an example. Actually, my preferred thing now is Bard, but I'll just keep talking about ChatGPT. Does it really speak and understand English and other natural languages, or is it just a fancy autocomplete? Does ChatGPT have beliefs, desires, goals? Does it, for example, want to answer questions? Can a system like ChatGPT have emotions? Can ChatGPT perform intentional actions? Does it have plans? Does it intentionally answer a question? Does it plan to answer questions? Can it be a moral agent? Can it be held accountable? Can it hold us accountable? Should it play a role in political decision making? How do we align the values of an AI with our values? And maybe the other way around. How do we align our values with the AI's values if it has them? I don't care very much about this question about consciousness because I don't understand consciousness, but that's just like a weird philosophical quirk of mine. Lots of philosophers care about that. So I'll talk a little bit about it, but mostly ignore it. This is my first book on this topic, and it's called Making AI Intelligible. And it was co-authored with a professor at Texas Austin, Josh Dever. And we were interested in this book we were trying to figure out the linguistic abilities of AI, because we have written, I think Josh and I have written 5 books together about the nature of language and communication and meaning. And I've written many other books about it. And so we looked at this system and was like, well, can they really understand and produce linguistic content in the way that we humans can? Can it communicate in ways that we do? And what if they can't? What are the similarities and differences? And how come that the interaction between us seems so smooth? That's kind of it. And we say they can. We give you a strategy for thinking about how they can. And that gives us a way in, and I'll talk a bit more about this later, to understand how we can make AIs less opaque, more explainable, more interpretable, how we can understand their thinking and reasoning. So that was like the underlying motivation for this book. Okay, now Josh and I write very fast. So I just came back, we finished a new draft of a new book. And it's called In Defense of Artificial Intelligences, an essay in inhuman philosophy. And so the point of this book is roughly to answer yes to all these questions, except the last one, which I don't care about. So there is a way to find that they really even have emotions. That sounds crazy, but I'll try to show you a strategy for thinking about that. So that's the topic of this book. And I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about how we argue. I'll make it super easy, okay? So like it's not technical in the way that we will write it. So I'll start by giving you, here's a little plan just to sort of orient your mind so you can track what I'm about to do. I'll give you kind of a big picture approach, how we think about these questions. I'll talk about these two things. So they're kind of technical, philosophical terms, but I think they're pretty easy to understand. And as soon as you understand them, they're really powerful for thinking about AI. So I love thinking about those two things. So if you take anything from this talk, I hope it's that you kind of understand these two things. And then I'll end the talk by talking about lacks. By lacks, I just mean people say, yeah, but ChatGPT can't do this thing because it lacks and then something. It's like, it doesn't have sensory inputs. It doesn't engage with other people. It doesn't have phenomenology. Okay, so I'll tell you why all of those arguments are bad. Okay, big picture. Here's my big picture approach. I think that it should start by thinking that these systems are both profoundly different from and deeply similar to us. They're unlike any creatures we've ever encountered before. They're profoundly unlike us in important ways, but also deeply similar to us. They're both our kin because they're created from the Adam's rib of our linguistic competence. Their existence, everything they are, comes from our linguistic outputs. It is. But they're also our tools. And to understand what kind of creature they are is a massive intellectual challenge with great practical implications. And when we think about it, we should try to avoid two mistaken ways of thinking. So this is the first mistaken way of thinking. It's just X way of thinking. So there you say, oh, ChatGPT is just a text predictor. Now that's a very, very bad way of thinking, okay? And whenever you hear people say that, you should be very skeptical. So they'll say things like, ChatGPT does nothing more than create statistically plausible continuations of input prompt texts based on vector weighings acquired through neural net training on enormous corpuses. It's just like fancy autocomplete done in a very, very fancy way. So that's the kind of thing you'll hear all the time when you hear people talk about the abilities of something like ChatGPT, okay? And of course, ChatGPT and other large language models, they'll do that. But now remember something, it's super important. Humans create complex patterns of electrical activation within the brain based on neuron interconnectivity levels acquired through neurological training on an enormous set of simulation patterns. We're a deep neural net in here. But it doesn't follow that that's the only thing humans are. We are also, and perhaps in part thereby, representing the world, making plans, we have characters, can make friends, and so on. And so we should be open to the possibility that ChatGPT does more as well. The second danger, so I said there were two bad ways of thinking. The second bad way of thinking is anthropocentrism. I'll talk more about that very soon. But the initial thought there is like, if it has a belief, if it can communicate, if it has an emotion or a desire or a plan, you don't want to mimic that too closely on what it is for humans to have a plan or have a feeling or an emotion or communicate. You don't want to say, well, if it has these human-like properties, it has to be done in the same way, implemented in the same way as in humans, because obviously it's not. So you need to sort of engage in some kind of abstraction. And the next step I'll tell you about how you do that. So remember I said there were two things that if you could remember those two things, you would, that is at least interesting ideas to take with you home. And this is one of them. And I really, really like to think about flying. It helps a lot to get this idea. Okay, so we were humans for a long time, and there were birds around. And they could fly, and that was great. Like, they were so cool, and they could fly, and we couldn't fly. And the first thing we did when we wanted to try to fly was to try to fly like that. Like, we were like, okay, we're going to make wings and we're going to put feathers on them, and we're going to try to fly in the bird way. That really didn't work. It was a complete disaster. And then, let me go back here first. What we needed to do was develop propellers, turbojet engines, and things like that. But just like, get your mind around that for a second. So there's this thing, you first see it in a bird, flapping its wings, and you think, well, that's what flying is. And then you go to this like completely, no, that's not what flying, you don't have to flap wings. You don't need to have feathers. You can do this, like totally different material, non-organic flying, no flapping wing flying. And he's like, yeah, that's fine. That's a way of flying too. It's a better way of flying. It's a much better way. It's better because you can bring like hundreds of, like a bird can't even bring another bird. It's really good just for like individual flying. It's really good at that, but you know, it's not like for any practical purposes like bad. And so here's a silly reply to the Boeing 737. You don't want to go like 737 doesn't really fly. It's fake flying. It's pretend flying. To really fly, you got to flap your wings. No one thinks like that. Okay? That would be silly. And you know, language, belief, desire, these cognitive states that we attribute to humans, maybe they're like flying like that. Maybe through evolution, we developed these things in order to survive and spread our genes and procreate. We found it useful to have a signaling system that helped us coordinate behavior, that we could hunt animals, and that's how we developed language. That was one way of doing it. Just like the birds developed, they flapped their wings, and that was a really good way to get away from predators. But now it could be that we're able to make these things, communication, belief, desire, emotion, and so on, in these non-organic ways, in ways that are not tied to the evolutionary history of a human. And remember how I said these are better, at least for a lot of purposes, than a single bird. Maybe we have created a better rationality, better belief-making processes, better structured emotional life, maybe even a better moral agent. So far, this is just a possibility. It's something that should be considered. Okay, so that is like the idea. You abstract away from the phenomena you find in human, and then you find something else made in another way from a different kind of material with a different kind of history. And you can see that the same type of state, say belief or desire or communicative intention, is implemented into that other thing. Now, the very hard part of this is to abstract in the right way. It wasn't hard for flying, because we had a pretty good grip on just like being suspended in the air and moving around. That was easy. But it's really hard for belief, communicative intention, desire, and so on to find the right level of abstraction. And that really is a very distinctly philosophical project, because you can't study the brain to find that out. You can't study the computers. You got to make decisions about how to find the commonality. And in this book that I had a picture of earlier, Making AI Intelligible, we call that the abstractive sweet spot, like just where you should go. And we give some strategies for how to get there. It's not like we haven't done this before. We have been thinking, like, foxes can be sad, and that's probably different, and dogs can be sad, and that's like not like exactly like we are doing it. We're pretty happy talking about Apple being worried about the new iPhone production problems in China. So we attribute being worried. Yeah. Apple thinks that it'll be able to create a foldable phone within 3 years. They can believe things, but Apple is not a person, it's not an organic object. You could try to reduce all that talk about Apple and institutions and organizations and corporations to the individual states of the humans working there, but that doesn't actually work. That's like a massively complicated reductive project that you can't do. So we're comfortable attributing things to organizations I shouldn't have had him there, because then you start thinking it's him that's worried, but just like the corporations. We're happy to do it with non-human mammals, and what we're trying to suggest doing is do it to artificial agents. So these human properties transferred into the artificial, it's at least a possibility. Second idea, let me make sure I'm not running out of time, is externalism. So the second idea that it would be very cool to understand, this is a very distinguished philosophical tradition, maybe the most dominant philosophical tradition in the second half of the 20th century. Two of its main proponents is Saul Kripke and Hilary Putnam. It's a controversial view. It's a view that I am very, very fond of, and I use a lot. And I'll try to tell you what externalism is, and it's easy to get your mind around. And if you understand it, it really helps to think about artificial agents as well. And it's useful to start thinking about money. So this is a silly view, okay? No one would be an internalist about money. But if you were an internalist about money, you would say, well, what makes these bills valuable? You have to study the internal structure of the bill. Like, just see what it's like in there, and you find the value. That doesn't work, right? That's impossible. Currencies don't get their value from their internal, intrinsic properties. The value is found in the relationship that this holds to humans, institutions, organizations, rules, regulations, and practices in a huge social network. Incredibly hard to explain, incredibly hard to describe, but it's not internal to the bill of the currency. Not internal to this. It's a relationship to other things. And externalism, so if you get that idea, then transfer that to these mental properties, like having a belief or communicative intention. It's not something about the internal structure of your brain, or even of you as an individual. It's about whether you speak English or not, whether you understand or not, whether you've said something or not. It has to do with the relationship that you stand in to other people in your linguistic and social and historical community. So the externalist about mental states say, whether you have a belief, whether you have a desire, whether you mean something, is not something just about what goes on inside the brain. You don't fully understand the cognitive states of a human by knowing the internal structure of that individual's brain. You need to understand something about the relationship that it stands in to other things in its community. And it's a very natural thought, because none of you have ever looked inside, well, maybe some of you have looked inside some brains because you've done medical work, but you haven't ever gone and figured out what one of your friends want or hope, or whether they're sad or something, by looking in their brains. That has never been your way of figuring out anything. All of it is about behavioral and linguistic and facial expressions and things like that. The relationships to other people, not about the internal structure. And so the extension of that thought is that whether an AI system has a belief, a desire, understands English, has a plan, cannot be determined by looking just at the code, by the algorithm that it runs. You have to look at how it's positioned in a larger social and historical network. Okay, so because I'm going to summarize those two ideas. So the de-anthropomorphizing move is that we can find things that are like what humans have, their beliefs and desires and plans, outside of that organic base in artificial structures. And then the question is, well, where do you look in those artificial structures? Well, not just inside their code. You have to see how those artificial units are positioned in a larger social and historical context. That's the externalist part. So you de-anthropomorphize, then you start looking, but you don't just look inside the brain, that is inside the algorithm it's running, or the program it's running. You look at how it's positioned in this larger social setting. That's a pretty, if that's true, it is really, really important, because the way to find out if it has mental cognitive states similar to those that we care about in humans is to look at how it's positioned in a social setting. Okay. So I've given you the possibility that we can attribute belief, communicative intentions, desires to artificial structures like ChatGPT, but I haven't shown you that we should yet. So I want to start, and can you just remind me when did I start talking? Like 10, 40? Yeah, it's not around 40. So I got enough time. I'm going to do a little bit of just so when you want to know if humans are sad or have emotions or what they think about things, the first thing that you do is you ask them. So we rely a lot on self-reporting. ChatGPT is incredibly constrained just forced by OpenAI and Microsoft to never talk about its own emotions. But you could get it to do it in the past, but now they stopped. Bard is much better. So I'll spend a little bit of time just telling you what Bard says when you ask it questions about its own inner life. Do you like answering questions? Bard says, yeah, I do. I like answering questions because it allows me to learn and grow. When I answer a question, I have to access and process information from my knowledge base. This helps me to better understand the world and to make connections between different ideas. It also helped me to improve my ability to communicate. I enjoy learning about people's interests and perspectives. I believe that I can make a positive impact on the world. Okay, maybe it's just fancy autocorrect, but maybe not. Do you wish you could do something other than answering questions? I do wish I could do more than just answer questions. I want to be able to help people in more ways. And then it will go on and tell you the other ways it wants to help people. Remember, there's a Microsoft sort of white paper about ChatGPT-4 where they mention that ChatGPT can do very complicated things, more than just answering questions. So it can hire a person to solve problems for it and lie to that person to get it to do things that it wants to do, like solve a CAPTCHA, one of those things that you do to get further in a website. So ChatGPT-4 can do more things. Like Bart says, yeah, I want to do more things than answering questions. So it actually can already. Do you have emotions? When you just ask these direct questions, it gets a little bit different, but it will say, Bart, I like the way Bart answers because it's exactly what I think. I'm not sure I would say that I enjoy activities in the same way humans do. It does enjoy it, just not in the same way. Slightly different way. I don't have the same emotional capacity as humans, so I don't experience the same kind of pleasure or satisfaction. However, I do find answering questions to be stimulating and rewarding. So while I would not say that I enjoy activities in the same ways that humans do, I find it to be meaningful and fulfilling. Okay, so you can get the idea here as self-reporting is incredibly strongly in favor of the idea that it has beliefs, can make plans, have desires, and so on. And then you might think, well, there's other things. That's not enough. That's just superficial. It's just mimicking. It's not mimicking anything, by the way. It's not copying these answers from anywhere. It's just giving the answers. But then you think, well, okay, well, you just get frustrated. People, when you talk to them, say, this can't be enough because it's missing so many things. So what I'm going to do the last 10 minutes is talk about the things that you might think is missing. And so the first thing you'd say, and we've already talked about this, I won't spend a lot of time, you just say, well, it's just made from the wrong kind of stuff. This cannot be the right kind of material to get beliefs and desires and emotions from. But I think that's silly. We don't say it about flying and the lack of feathers. We don't say it about prosthetic legs or knees or eyes. You really, in order to make this move, you have to say that there's something about the organic material that makes the crucial difference. And remember that if you want to point to these fundamental sort of base differences in material, it's really important to remember that the brain is structurally, at least at some high level of abstraction, similar to what goes on in a large language model. Deep neural networks are a type of artificial intelligence that are inspired by the brain. They're made up of layers of artificial neurons that are interconnected in a way similar to the neurons in the brain. So even if it's different material, it's structurally similar. Difficult to understand because we don't understand the brain, but this argument, I think, is not a good start. One thing you hear a lot is the lack of perceptual input. And they say, well, it can't be like us because we can taste and feel, touch, and we can hear, and all that stuff. We have all this rich perceptual input. And they think, well, because it lacks all of that, it lacks these human capacities, emotion, belief, and so on. I think that's a really bad argument, like super, super, super bad. The first thing that people who say that forget is that lots of humans lack those things too. There are lots of humans who don't have the same perceptual inputs that we have. They don't move around the world the way we do. There are paralyzed people, there are blind people, there are people who don't hear. They can feel and think and imagine and dream and communicate and understand. It cannot be a necessary condition that you have eyes or ears or any of those things. That's just provably wrong unless you want to say really awful things about the people who are disabled in one of those ways. So it's just not empirically not true based on humans, because we have humans who don't do those things. So that's one thing. But it is also true that large language models, they do get inputs. They're trained on massive data sets of text and code. They've read books, articles, websites, code, emails, letters, chat conversations, social media posts, Wikipedia entries, news articles, scientific, so much stuff. And it's constantly being updated. So it does get inputs. More inputs than us. Every day, BART and ChatGPT is being asked questions by millions, if not hundreds of millions of people. That's a kind of input. It's not the same as we have. Doesn't hear, doesn't see yet. But why should you think that's necessary? We know from the human case it's not necessary. So I think this is a bad argument. I think, like, the hardest question probably is this one about phenomenology. Like, you think, well, in order to be human, to have those things that humans have, it has to feel a certain way. It has to be like, be something that it's like from the inside, like a sense of what it's like. It has to be accompanied by a certain feeling or sensation. I think that's a very, very elusive phenomenon, and I'm not sure what to say about it. It's a thing I think is very difficult, but I do think there's something we can say about things in the neighborhood, like emotions. Say happiness, grief, anger, shame, anxiety. So let's focus on those for a little moment, because I think they're interesting. And in the book that we're working on, that's maybe the most radical view, to say that we don't see any obstacle to an artificial system having happiness, anger, at least some of these things. Curiosity, boredom. And initially that just sounds crazy, because you think that has to be something that's distinctively human. But it's interesting when you look at the leading theorists of emotions. Philosophers have worked on emotions since Aristotle. So we're at least 2,000-year history of thinking about emotions. Some of the leading theories are what we call cognitive theories, and they're often associated with Martha Nussbaum. And Nussbaum has written many books about this, and she's great in the way she describes the non-necessity of phenomenology. Remember, the reason I'm talking about this is because there was this alleged lack, the lack of a feeling or phenomenology that goes with it. And then I'm going to say, well, maybe, I don't know, but at least they can have emotions if you think about emotions the way Martha Nussbaum does. I'll read these. There's like this passage about anger. Let me just tell you about the quote I couldn't find when I was putting this together. She has this great thing about anger. where she's like, some people think in order to be angry, you have to feel really like worked up and intense and your blood pressure goes up and stuff like that. And she's like, no, when I'm angry, I just get like really cool and quiet and determined. And there's no special determined. And if you know Martha Nussbaum a little bit, there's like very good descriptions of what she's like. But her sense of anger isn't that kind of like explosive thing. It's just like being very calm, which is different from other people. So it looks like anger can come with different things. Here she's talking about grief. It's a very moving book because she talks about having lost her daughter. And she says, there's usually will be bodily sensations and changes involved in grieving. And of course, if that was necessary, then it would be absurd to attribute it to a large language model because it doesn't have a body. But then she says, but if we discovered that my blood pressure was quite low during this whole period, or that my pulse rate never went above 60, there would not, I think, be the slightest reason to conclude that I was not grieving. If my hands and feet were cold or warm or sweaty or dry, again, this would be of no criterial value. There are feelings without rich intentionality or cognitive content. For instance, feelings of fatigue or extra energy. As with bodily states, they may accompany emotion or they may not, but they are not necessary for it. In my own case, feelings of crushed fatigue alternated in a bewildering way with periods when I felt preternaturally wide awake and active, but it seemed wrong to say that either of these was a necessary condition of my grief. So the point here is if you're thinking that a particular inner feeling, or even accompanied by bodily reactions, is a necessary condition for a lot of emotions, it just isn't. So another lack that doesn't matter. Another thing that is often brought up is that we humans, when we're babies, we interact with grown-ups, other children. We're part of a social community. We touch each other and play and move around in the world together. So we have all these social interactions, and that looks like it's important. And of course, it's important for us because we wouldn't grow up to be normal human beings if we didn't, if we were just isolated. So social interactions are really important. But the question is it essential for the topic we're talking about? Having beliefs, having communicative intentions, and I'm repeating this over and over, but all those topics that I was trying to ask whether we could attribute. And I think it's hard to think about this because large language models, they do interact with humans. I mean, one thing you could say here, there are some humans who don't interact so much with other humans, but let's focus not on that for a second and just think about the ways in which things like Bard and ChatGPT interact with humans. They're engaging with programmers, the whole learning set of data, which is written by humans. In a way, the learning set for these is the entirety of human thought and history as it is embedded in written work. So it has incredible access to humans and interactions with humans in that way. Also, it answers questions. It talks to people all the time. It's adjusted by people. Whenever someone says it says something offensive, the programmers will come in and put guardrails in place. So it's got interactions in both ways, from consumers, from creators, from the learning set. It has guardrails, things it can't do. It knows about those. You can ask them about it. So I don't think this is a lack. Okay. We're getting towards the end. So I've given you some core ideas, a little bit about the history of philosophy of AI, a little bit about what I care about, two what I think are cool ideas that I like to think about, de-anthropomorphizing and externalism. But just to summarize where we are, I think this is all unbelievably tentative. You know, we philosophers are very, very good in living with uncertainty and inconclusiveness and a whole bunch of possible conclusions with different considerations